Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's talk, Edgar Allan Poe, the Man, the Mystery, the Legend. My name is Emily Hillwright, and I'm the Director of Operations at the Merchants House Museum, New York City's only family home to be preserved intact, both inside and out from the 19th century. Home to the Tredwell family and their Irish servants for nearly 100 years, the Merchants House is complete with the family's original furnishings and personal possessions. As many of you know, for the last 12 years, the Merchants House has been fighting proposed development next door, construction that is guaranteed to cause irreparable damage to our landmark building and will force us to close the museum to the public for at least 2 years. In December, in a shocking betrayal, the Landmarks Preservation Commission voted to approve the development, in spite of overwhelming and unanimous opposition from the community, preservation organizations, public officials, engineers, and preservation architects. This disastrous vote is a warning to every other landmark in New York City. If this can happen to the Merchants House, then every landmark in New York is at risk. We are currently working closely with our legal team to develop a strategy that will not only halt this unacceptable development, but ensure the safety of the Merchants House for generations to come. Please stay in touch, join our email list, and follow us on social media. We will be reaching out soon with calls to action. In the meantime, please consider a donation to our legal fund. Together, we can save the Merchants House. I am joined tonight by William Roca of Village Preservation, our co-host this evening. Hi, William.
Hello, thank you, Emily. And yeah, thank you, Merchants House, for letting us co-sponsor this wonderful program. And please do go and support the Merchants House. It's such a wonderful place, and Village Preservation absolutely supports the Merchants House. We want to make sure we keep it open so everyone can enjoy it. Just a quick little spiel on Village Preservation. If you are not familiar with Village Preservation, we've been documenting, protecting, and celebrating the culture, history, and architecture of Greenwich Village, East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We've helped get over 1,250 buildings protected and zoning protections for over 100 blocks in the area. We host about 75 to 80 programs a year. So if you're interested in learning more about Village Preservation, please just head over to villagepreservation.org and you can sign up to become a member, learn more about our programs, and enjoy all the things that we have to offer. But yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Our speakers tonight are Andrea Janes and Matilda Garrido. Andrea is the owner and founder of Burrows of the Dead and the co-author of A Haunted History of Invisible Women. She has also written the YA novel Glamour and several short stories. She lives in Brooklyn, where she can usually be found roaming in a cemetery, swimming in the ocean, or telling ghost stories to her daughter. You can visit her online at andreajanes.com. And then Matilda Garrido is a certified thanatologist and holds master's degrees in thanatology and bioethics. She has extensive experience working with the dying, families of the dying, and the bereaved. Matilda is also a Merchants House volunteer and co-hosts our monthly video podcast, In the Spirit of Science, which explores topics related to the ongoing paranormal research at the Merchants House. During tonight's talk, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of tonight's chat. So welcome, Andrea and Matilda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emily. And Andrea, thank you so much for being here. I consider you the penultimate Poe expert. So I'm just going to start off with a little disclaimer. I'll be, throwing out some dates and some facts that I have learned about Poe. If I have gotten anything wrong, please jump in and correct me. Yeah. So I would like to start with, I think what I would really like to know is how you came to Poe. What resonated with him? Were you first exposed to his work? What kind of brought you towards this idea of looking so intensely into his work and his life?
Right. I think I came to Poe like 90% of other people as a teenager. I was like a 15-year-old little wannabe goth kid. And this is true. I had a job, and looking back, I don't even know if this was legal because, again, I was 15, but I had a job as a secretary and receptionist in a psychiatrist's office. And some of my job was transcribing very interesting session notes. And then the rest of my job was just sitting there waiting for the phone to ring. And as I sat there, I have no idea how this came across my desk, but I got a tattered, cheap paperback copy of Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. I don't know how it ended up there. So I just started reading it while I was sitting around, kind of waiting for the phone to ring. And that was the beginning and the end. And it's so weirdly appropriate that I was in a psychiatrist's office at the time.
Yeah.
And then just like one thing led to another. And, as a teenage girl with a very predominant dark side, I became a fan of Poe. Kind of wandered away a little bit in college when I started thinking I had to become like a serious grown-up and do things in a conforming sort of way. And then once I finally shed all that and was like, nuts to that, I'm going to be a ghost tour guide. I noticed a lot of ghost tour companies in the city were really trading on the Poe marketing. And, for better or for worse, some did it well, some didn't do it very well. But they were using his image and his face and his writing to kind of plug their ghost tours. And the Poe content on the ghost tours was always very tangential, or it was maybe a little bit ginned up, And so I thought, what would be really cool would just be an actual Poe walking tour. And there had been some like one-offs here and there, probably even like Village Preservation offered one, because people would do them from time to time. But there was never like a consistent, regular all Poe tour that was offered like all the time. And I had some great, tremendous luck in 2013 when I started my company, Burrows of the Dead. One of our launch tours was an Edgar Allan Poe, the Edgar Allan Poe launch tour. And it just so happened to be the same year the Morgan Library did the Terror of the Soul exhibition. And it was just pure dumb luck. Time Out picked it up. All my tours sold out. My company took off. And like 10 years later, I'm still doing the same tour.
Yeah.
Each year it gets richer and there's more insights, and Poe is really the gift that never stops giving. And we can unpack that later.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. Is that the tour that I went on, the Poe in the Village tour? Yeah,
yes,
that was
Edgar
a
Allan Poe
wonderful tour.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to actually segue into his life in New York City, because although he was born in Baltimore and went to the University of Virginia, went to West Point, lived in Philadelphia for a time, he spent many years in New York City. From my notes, he came here in 1837 and was here just for a couple of months and lived in the Village on 6th and Waverly and on Carmine Street. Then moved back to Philadelphia. And then in 1844, he came for a much longer stay, lived down in the Village, then lived in what is called the Brennan Farmhouse on 84th and Broadway. And that's where he wrote The Raven. Which was inspired by the house that he lived in on Mount Tom, which is a rock formation in Riverside Park. So I thought that for anyone who loves The Raven, you can go up, and actually Mount Tom is still there. You can go and see it. So what I loved about the tour that you gave was that I really felt like I was kind of walking in his footsteps. And for anybody who's watching this who lives in New York, you can actually go around so many of the locations that he lived. Not every single home is still standing, but you can really kind of see the footsteps that he walked in. And if you would tell us a little bit about the park that used to be a graveyard that he used to walk to, which is in the Village down, which is also still there, right? And still does contain, it's not a grave, but it's a memorial to the firemen, right? So I found that very evocative. So I was going to ask you if you could kind of share a little bit of background around that time in his life and when he'd go walking there and things like that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I love that. So that's Old St. John's Burying Ground, which is at Leroy Street, and I think it is 7th Avenue. It's now called James J. Walker Park. And it's a cute little, I don't think it's a vest pocket park. It's a little bigger than that. But it's a small park on Leroy Street. And it's across from the residence of Mayor Jimmy Walker, former Mayor Jimmy Walker, which is why it's James J. Walker Park. And so right in that spot where now there's like a little kiddie pool, like a wading pool, and there were like bocce courts, and it's all fun and sweet, and it's a park for the neighborhood. That is on the site of Old St. John's Burying Ground, like so many, and I think most historically minded people in New York already are aware of this, but like most parks in Manhattan below, a certain street, it's a former cemetery. So Old St. John's Burying Ground was an active burial ground when Poe lived in that neighborhood on Carmine Street and 6th and Waverly in 1837. And he would have enjoyed taking walks there when he was in his somber moods. I think that it is a universal, like it's axiomatic that all writers enjoy taking walks in cemeteries. I've never met a writer who doesn't. I mean, I know all people do, most people do that I know, but writers especially. We like to purloin names from tombstones. So he would have been highly aware of some important people that were buried there and notorious people that were buried there, including one of my favorite stories of all time, Helen Jewett. Helen Jewett is a bit of a tangent, so I'm just gonna like table her for a second. But so he would have walked around there. He would have, strolled through that fairly small burial ground. I can't imagine it was much bigger than like Trinity Wall Street burial ground is now. And he certainly would have enjoyed walking there. There would not have been too many places for Poe to ramble when he lived in that neighborhood. And Poe loves to ramble. He loves to walk. He loved to swim. He loved to row. He once rowed a skiff around Blackwell's Island, now Roosevelt Island. So he would have definitely liked a good stroll. Washington Square would have been like a pedestrian and carriage traffic square. He could have strolled around that little park. Another burial ground. But there would have been no like Hudson River Park. So he couldn't have strolled there. That was just shipping warehouses, wharves. So he would have rambled the neighborhood and had that little park as a space where he could go and kind of exhale a little bit. He, ironically, although he was a very dyed-in-the-wool urbanite his whole life, he never really lived in the country. He was very much a nature boy in many ways and happiest when he was nature adjacent. He would have looked for any kind of thing that resembled a green space, a place to walk, a place to kind of unfurl his mind. And I think that's why when he finally got up to the Bronx, he was pretty happy up there, actually.
Yeah, I mean, from what I understand, he moved to Poe Cottage, which is in the Bronx, and which is still on a very limited basis, open to the public. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Poe Cottage later. But it's my understanding that he moved there because he thought that the fresh air would be good for Virginia, who had started to suffer from tuberculosis at that time.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors for why they moved there specifically. So definitely fresh air for Virginia, and he was always trying to get fresh air for her. She had first presented with tuberculosis in 1842 when they were living in Philly. And she kind of would go on and off, relapse and remission, back and forth. So undoubtedly the fresh air would have been a factor. That may have even been a factor in why he chose to reside close to Washington Square several times. Because he lived on Amity Street, now West 3rd, twice. So he would have definitely factored that in. The rent was cheap. There was like a family connection that gave him a sweetheart deal. I think it was $100 a year for the cottage, and it was furnished. The Valentines are like some distant relation of the Poes, I believe. And then another factor is that he kind of suffered social death in Greenwich Village in 1845. And there's this very touching acrostic poem written by Virginia where she's begging Poe to like leave the fray of the city and go to somewhere far away to remove them from the madness. There was a terrible scandal. We can talk all about it, but things socially were very bad for him in the city, and it was kind of like a peace out, y'all.
Let's talk about that. That's very interesting. So this would have been in like the 1845, 1846 sort of era, after he had kind of resettled back in the Village area and had started to really make a name for himself, like as an editor and things like that. So let's talk a little bit about his social death that sent him fleeing to the Bronx.
every time I think about it, I cringe. It's so awkward. So the winter of 1845, when Poe's living on Amity Street, now West 3rd, is a very good time for him. He's riding a high from publishing The Raven. He's being invited to all kinds of social gatherings. He's well known, he's well regarded. He's finally working on the Broadway Journal, which is, his dream for ages has been to run his own literary journal. So he's like got everything going for him. And then, because he's Poe, he screws everything up. And he gets into, first of all, the Broadway Journal folds, lack of funds. He gets into this really weird love triangle with a married woman named Frances Sargent Osgood. He gets into a tangle with another woman named Elizabeth Elliot. Elizabeth Elliot was a writer as well. She was a historian, and Mrs. Osgood was a poet. And so they all knew each other from their kind of literary and social circles in Greenwich Village. And Mrs. Elliot had an unrequited crush on Poe. And she sent him all of these gushy love letters, and he did not respond to them. So he was ghosting her. Meanwhile, he's carrying on a very, very passionate flirtation through letters with Mrs. Osgood. And he writes her poems, some of which he publishes in the Broadway Journal.
And he's married to Virginia at this time.
Totally married, straight up married to Virginia this whole time, who's like right there.
Living with her and her mother in the same house.
Yeah. So they're all there.
Did she know? Did she know? Is there evidence that either of them knew?
Yes. So Virginia was totally aware of the existence of Mrs. Osgood and the friendship that she had with her husband. Some of our accounts from that time come from Mrs. Osgood, so they're very biased. But according to Frances, Virginia approved of their friendship. She thought that Poe was more temperate and drank less with her. And when Poe was writing a work called The Literati of New York City, which again, that's a whole other thread, but these were descriptions of everybody he knew in the city, and he dished and it got very personal. He wrote a lengthy, very flattering description of Mrs. Osgood. And I guess he had written on paper that he scrolled up. And according to Mrs. Osgood, she came over one day and Virginia said, "Oh, look at this," and unrolled the scroll and like simpered and scampered and was like, "It's your own sweet self," like it's, I don't know. So yes, Virginia knew that they were good friends. The weirdest thing about this, though, is that Mrs. Osgood's husband painted an oil portrait of Poe. It's a kind of a famous portrait of him without his mustache, one of the few extant images of non-mustached Poe that we have. And he painted this painting, and I can't imagine how awkward those sittings must have been for Poe to sit there and get painted by Mr. Osgood, whose wife he was currently having this weird public flirtation with. Or maybe it wasn't awkward at all. Who knows? Maybe they were like very boho and avant-garde and they were all cool with their thruppledom. I don't know how it went, really. But long story short, things get really, really bad when Elizabeth Elliot comes to play, because she's completely getting the cold shoulder from Poe and it angers her. So she gets a little gaggle of her friends, and this is very middle school, but these are like grown adults, professional, accomplished people. Mrs. Elliot, got a little group of her friends, including Anne Charlotte Lynch Bota, who was a woman who lived on Waverly Place at 116 Waverly. She had these very famous literary salons, which Poe would attend, and it is fairly well established that he read The Raven in public for the first time at one of Mrs. Lynch's salons. So Elliot gets Mrs. Lynch, and of all people, Margaret Fuller, like the writer, the transcendentalist mystic writer, Margaret Fuller, who's just hanging out with all these cats. And they go over to Poe's house and they demand the return of Mrs. Osgood's letters for the sake of propriety. And Poe apparently refuses to come to the door, and through Virginia delivers the message, perhaps Mrs. Elliot better look after her own letters. So it's so catty, it's so gossipy, and it drove Virginia nuts ultimately. Like whatever Frances Osgood meant to her was one thing, but Mrs. Elliot drove her crazy. And she apparently even said, on her deathbed, Mrs. Elliot has been my murderer. Like she stressed her out so much.
Aww.
So that's why I chose to do my tour in Greenwich Village, not in Lower Manhattan, not in the Bronx. I'm like, because this is so gossipy and so weird and so good.
Yeah, yeah.
The world must know.
So that was the sort of really the end of his social standing in Greenwich Village and in New York City literary circles?
Yeah. So because after that, in the aftermath, Mrs. Elliot's brother like challenges him to a duel. He tries to borrow a pistol from his friend Thomas Dunn English. Thomas Dunn English refuses to lend it to him. He gets into a public fistfight with him. And Rufus Griswold is witnessing the whole thing and like tut-tutting and being like, I told you Poe was bad news. Griswold incidentally is like BFFs with Mrs. Elliot.
Okay.
And then the two
what
of
a
them.
Tangled web.
Yes, I feel like I need a diagram. So Mrs. Elliot and Rufus Griswold are like anti-Poe from that moment on. And we all know that Griswold will spend the rest of his life smearing Poe. So that's the point where Virginia's like, we've got to get out of here. And Poe's like, concur. He's like suing people for libel. He's getting reputations being a madman. Things are going really off the rails. And then remember I talked about the literati?
Yeah.
So turns out when you publish in Godey's Ladies book, which is like the widest circulating magazine in the nation at the time, when you publish very dishy, personal, semi-insulting profiles of everybody you work with, sometimes that doesn't go great for your career.
Yeah. Yeah, he's kind of like the Perez Hilton of his time, I feel
yes.
like.
Yes. Thank you. Sometimes you need a good Y2K reference to make it stick. But yeah, and he wrote some really insulting things about people. His friend Nathaniel P. Willis, he wrote, neither his nose or his forehead can be defended. Like he talked about people's faces and bodies.
Really personal stuff.
Really personal stuff. So yeah, so that's social death for him. And again, because he never really made any money off the Raven. He's still trying to borrow money. He's still broke. He's still kind of going off the rails. There's this one really disastrous night where he has a lecture scheduled and it has like the weather's terrible and it snows. Nobody shows up and he gets totally drunk and shows up still drunk at the office the next morning. So like he's just kind of going off the rails.
Right. Right.
And, yeah.
What I find so fascinating about this actually is that when they moved up to Poe Cottage, he became quite prolific at Poe Cottage. He wrote The Cask of Amontillado, The Bells, Annabel Lee, Eureka. And, you know, given that this is the time when Virginia was likely getting sicker, so his life would have been much more stressful. Yeah. He's just been totally ostracized. And all of a sudden he starts to produce all of this work.
Yeah. And I mean,
do you think he was kind of sublimating like all of his frustrations and his upset into his writing?
I think he probably always was in a way. But the thing about Poe is he never really stopped being prolific.
Okay.
And there was, you know, I can't, except for a few periods, and one of them was in New York where he doesn't write very much and we don't really know much about what he's doing. He's pretty consistently prolific for most of his life, no matter what he's going through. And I think that probably, you know, the more upset he was, probably the more refuge he took in writing. I know that Eureka was written almost in like direct response to Virginia's death. And also like these things take time, you know, like you mentioned 4 or 5 short stories or poems, and that's like in a 4-year period, you know, so he's, I would say he's like, fairly prolific, but not like astonishingly so. Whereas I think in Philadelphia, that's when he was writing, you know, the most impressive stuff in the most compressed amount of time.
Is that before he came to New York in the 1840s?
between his two New York sojourns, like in the early 1840s.
And that's when he wrote Murders in the Rue Morgue, right, in Philadelphia, which, as you know, most everybody knows is really considered the very first modern detective story.
Yeah, and I'm unfortunately, as a literary critic, very biased. I love all the short stories, but I'm not a poet. And I don't think that I appreciate poetry fundamentally the same way I appreciate the short story. So maybe somebody who understands poetry more will be like, no, you're dead wrong. The New York period is far more significant in terms of his output. But like as a short story writer myself, I'm very impressed with what he wrote in Philadelphia. That being said, I think The Cask of Amontillado may be one of his best stories. just in terms of what a like neat, compressed story it is. And that was written here. So, but these things take time. Like he definitely finished that story while he was up in the Bronx, but he had already begun working drafts of that while he was on Amity Street. So, these timelines are really malleable and like more extended, I think, than just the publication date. So, it could take a year to write a story.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about like a psychological portrait of Poe. Just in doing some of the research, a lot of the pieces that I read were trying to figure out or discern nature versus nurture in terms of his psychological development. He was orphaned at a young age. He was taken in but never adopted by the family that took him in. Deeply loved his, we'll call her his adopted mom, but never really fully accepted by his father, adoptive father, and in fact became estranged from him later in life.
Yeah.
But his own father, his biological father, was a heavy drinker, and also may have suffered from mental illness. His mother was likely under a lot of strain while she was pregnant with him. So maternal stress might have played a role. I mean, if we're looking at sort of at all of the possible organic causes of, I don't think it's demeaning to call him a depressive. I think there's every evidence that he was quite seriously depressed through most of his life. And, was sort of constantly surrounded by death and maybe not really equipped to deal with that very well. Also surrounded a lot by the same kind of death. Tuberculosis. Many of the women in his life who he loved died of TB. And with Virginia, as you said, she had TB for quite a while, and it waxed and waned. So he was likely in this sort of very up and down state, according to how well she was or was not, from the time that she got sick up until when she died. And then, because he was a quite a heavy drinker, which is also a depressant, that likely was to become sort of a vicious circle for him. Like he would get depressed or frustrated, drink, that would cause him to become more depressed and maybe act in ways that were a little bit self-destructive, which would then maybe send him drinking again. And I'm just so interested in what you think about that, and whether you also think that in addition to all of those sort of negative things, whether his own success might have been a stressor for him.
That's a really interesting question. I love that. His own success, I think, may have been a stressor in that, okay, so if you're looking at a psychological portrait of Poe, you're going to very quickly, inevitably find a picture of a man who does not have healthy self-esteem, obviously.
Yeah.
So people with unhealthy self-esteem tend to self-sabotage a lot. And that could be why a lot of his darkest mental periods correlate with his periods of greatest commercial success. Well, I'll say critical success. He never had commercial success. He never made any money, which also made him depressed.
Sure, he was quite poor throughout his life. He never really sort of enjoyed the fruits of his labor.
Absolutely. So he would have been embittered by the fact that he was getting critical acclaim, but no material success out of it. That would have embittered and frustrated him.
Because people were at that time, right? There were people who were making money from writing and poetry and things like that.
Some people were doing fairly well and making a decent living. Those who were most comfortable mostly had family money, and it really explains his weird obsession with Longfellow. Longfellow had family money, and he had a comfortable sinecure in, I think, Harvard University. He was like a chair. So I guess he had a chair. No, he was a chair. I don't really know the nomenclature. I've never been on the university board. So Longfellow is a very comfortably situated human being. And I think that explains a lot of Poe's animus towards him. So yeah.
So did he have a lot of animosity towards Longfellow? I didn't know that.
Yeah, he publicly
Okay.
accused Longfellow of plagiarism and like was weirdly obsessed with destroying and besmirching Longfellow. He just like was oddly fixated on this one guy. And and Longfellow, to his credit, was like, I'm paraphrasing, but he was essentially like, you know, Poe's life is one that has been filled with much poverty and frustration. And I do believe that he is just kind of taking it out on me. And I don't really think it's personal. Like Longfellow took the high road. And, you know, it makes me sad. I'm like, if Poe had lived longer, he and Longfellow may have become friends, because then Longfellow suffered great personal tragedy and lost his wife. And I'm like, maybe they could have, you know, been two widowers hanging out together, and he could have, who knows, you know, like so many things could have gone right, but Poe ensured every time they went wrong. So, so he's definitely embittered with his financial situation. And he definitely has such a void of self-esteem that every time things start to go well for him, he must sabotage them. He cannot be successful. He is just terrified of success. He will not know how to feel. He will not know what to do if things go well for him, because his entire life, nothing has gone well for him. So he's just like, I can't, this doesn't compute. I've got to destroy this. Of course, this is all subconscious. He recognizes this impulse in himself and he gives it a name. He calls it the imp of the perverse, and he writes a short story about it. And by recognizing and naming compulsion as a concept, Poe, and again, I think this is why he's so popular, he really hones in on this modern idea, this modern psychological concept, you know, compulsion, these things we do as we know we shouldn't do them. In the same way he honed in on the concept that alcoholism is a disease and not a moral failing. He recognized that. So yeah, you have a number of hereditary factors, a number of societal factors. You have that really dreadful repetition, these disasters always occurring in pairs, or they're twos or threes or fours. And when something terrible happens to you more than once and it's the same thing, you do start to wonder if you're cursed, you know? And so it really messes with your mind. So he's got just every single possible factor in the world that will absolutely lay the groundwork for him being miserable. Then he's got, as you said, the hereditary factors. I do think that he had depressive episodes, perhaps low-grade chronic depression with more intense intermittent episodes. Maybe, I think I wouldn't rule out bipolar either. Because
or manic, yeah.
Oh, very manic, very manic. So yes, absolutely. And then the hereditary alcoholism. And it's kind of unfortunate because Poe got so much flack for all of his drinking, when like in terms of the quantity of what he drank, he probably drank far less than most men of his time. You know, the early 19th century is a very boozy time. But
and he did have periods of sobriety, right? So, like some quite long periods of sobriety.
Yeah, yeah. And he worked hard at it. But I think the number one like marker of an alcoholic is like in somebody's personal correspondence, someone who doesn't have a drinking problem doesn't talk about how they didn't have a drink last week.
Right.
You know, it doesn't occur to them. So you can see he struggles.
Yeah.
And then there's the very basic physiological bodily stuff. We talk about his poverty, but you know, I think he was malnourished for a lot of his adult life. There are days where he just had like bread and molasses and coffee. So he wasn't getting enough to eat. He didn't have an adequate diet. You know?
And didn't I read someplace, although I don't know how they would have known this at that time because they didn't have MRIs and stuff, that he had a brain lesion?
Yeah, there was some sort of talk to that effect, either a lesion or a tumor or a stroke or something. And I wouldn't rule out stroke as a possible cause of death. He did have several like social acquaintanceships with medical practitioners. He was friends with a lot of doctors, and some of them saw him personally and professionally. Yes, it's absolutely not beyond the realm of possibility that he had some sort of pre-existing condition. He may have had some strokes, several strokes in his life. He may have had hypertension, which is a disease that is not only hereditary, but also comes from, as you know, living a stressful life, and what's more stressful than poverty. And, you know, so, yeah, there are so many possible causes for his behavior and his demise. But yeah, it's just, it's nature and nurture coming together in the most insidious and awful way, like just a perfect storm of everything bad that could happen to somebody, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about his death a little bit, because, you know, obviously, as you know, there have been so many different theories about how he died, why he died. I mean, just talking about his own, well, first of all, people didn't live that long back
Mhm.
then. So
Yeah.
so dying young was not unusual.
Mhm.
And you know, even without the potential suicide factor, depression is a risk factor for early death. Certainly, if he was malnourished, he would have been more susceptible to all of the illnesses going around at that time. But
He didn't sleep well either, which is another factor.
yeah, I thought that the theory, the suicide theory, was kind of interesting, and I wanted to ask you what you thought about that. Although
Right.
I mean, it would have been an unsuccessful suicide attempt, right? Because he was hospitalized, he was found very, very ill or very, very drunk or whatever, and then hospitalized and then died in the hospital. So if it was suicide, it's not like he committed suicide and it's like a done deal.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but
Yeah.
what are your thoughts about that? What are your thoughts about the various theories about his death?
Yeah. So there is there's a very good possibility that he did try and kill himself in 1848, up in, I believe it was Providence. I guess he
Okay.
was on a train and he took a bunch of laudanum, and he later said that he miscalculated the dose. So who knows? Maybe he genuinely took the wrong amount of laudanum. I don't know. He was not a habitual drug user, so he may have
Mhm.
miscalculated the dose, or it may have been a suicide attempt. Um, so one of the articles that I read prior to this that you had sent me is called Deep into That Darkness Peering, and it's by Hannah J. Dean and Ryan Boyd. And there are two academics, they're psychologists, who basically studied all of the data. And what they did was they took a look at everything that Poe wrote in a certain period, and they did a
Yeah.
computational analysis of all the words that were like red flag words. And it's like these words that repeat in someone's correspondence are red flags that they're probably going to commit suicide. And they had analyzed
Yeah.
Marilyn Monroe and I think maybe David Foster Wallace, some other people. And so their findings suggest that although he certainly was depressed, he was not suicidal. And so they rule out, just based on an analysis of his correspondence and his short stories, which I think is a little, you know, I don't think that's a great methodology because they're an artifice. But I noticed that predominantly it was his correspondence they studied, so I think it's valid.
Mhm.
But you know, they rule out the possibility of suicide. They say that based on what he wrote on his letters and how often these words appear in his letters, he probably wasn't suicidal. Um,
Okay.
and you know, honestly, so what if he was? I mean, I don't think he was. His behavior at the time indicates that he was trying to get his life back on track.
Mhm.
And his behavior also indicates that he was not like healthy, physically
Right.
healthy, like something wasn't right. He wrote really bizarre letters to his mother-in-law, and he had strange hallucinations, like something I think was medically wrong with him. I don't think it was suicide either. Um,
Right.
you know,
And
if it
he
was,
had been in and out of the hospital in Baltimore right before his death, so you know, he was clearly physically unwell.
yeah. Yeah, he was, something wasn't right, and he had lost all of his luggage. He took the wrong train. He was wearing someone else's suit. People love to talk about the cooping theory, which is, you know, it's not impossible. It's not
Maybe you
improbable.
could just explain that a little bit for people who
Yeah,
might not be aware of it.
yeah. So people note that there was an election in Baltimore the day that he was found half dead behind this
Mhm.
tavern, and that it was common practice at the time for people to be kidnapped, plied with alcohol, and forced to vote repeatedly. And often people suggest this is
Election interference.
yeah, I know. Um, it's a great American tradition. So people often will point to this as a possible cause of his death. And it could have happened, but he could have been cooped. But I do think his death was inevitable. there seems to have been something he was fighting against. He also was publicly intoxicated, and I do believe did a night in jail for that at one point that summer prior to his death. So for me, like, I think his death is a fascinating mystery. And I do think it's really fitting that the father of the mystery genre in this country left us, the final ultimate mystery.
Sure.
I do think that this is a mystery that is meant to be contemplated and not solved. I don't really think we'll ever solve it. And I don't think it matters to me too much. It's the game, but the answer doesn't really matter to me that much. His father, David Poe, also had a mysterious death. And so I find that really interesting, the way the two of them kind of bookend each other.
Yeah.
Father just disappeared. So, and that's intriguing. At least we have some historical record of Poe's death. We have nothing, not a death certificate, no mention of his father. He's just gone. So he could have been the world's worst dad and left his entire family, or he could have been kidnapped and dead in a ditch somewhere, wishing he had been able to go back and say goodbye to them. Like, we have no idea. And that's fascinating to me. So again, this is what happens when you spend a lot of time with Edgar Poe. You move on to like the B-sides and you're like, what about David Poe? It's a sign you need to get out more.
Yeah. Well, what do you think accounts for his, I want to say he has a preoccupation with death, but I think it's more than death. I think death is more of a vehicle for him to, it's almost like he's dancing with the dark side somehow throughout his work. Like it's a personal exercise and trying to come to terms with something.
Yeah, for sure. And it's both him exercising those demons and processing all of his grief and trauma. And it's also very much a commercial impulse. So, he's coming up when he's a youngster, he's coming up in like the 1820s. And the Gothic is still a fashionable genre. And so he's kind of coming out of that tradition a little bit, and he's influenced by that tradition. And so it may be, and there were other early American writers who were also working in the Gothic tradition, Charles Brockden Brown and George Lepard. So there was an American Gothic. And he is very clear about his Gothic being American. It's not the terror of Germany, it's the terror of the soul. So he's artistically putting a twist on an existing tradition. Then he's also writing things he thinks will sell, because he's got to sell things to eat. So like how to write a Blackwoods article, like he's really much like pandering to this genre, to these traditions, to these styles and these expectations. And yeah, I of course, a man who was so profoundly traumatized and affected by death is going to explore it, and disease, especially with Mask of the Red Death. But what's really fascinating is like how when he has the final death that really, really gets him, when Virginia's turn comes, he doesn't write about death. He writes about the stars and the universe and the Big Bang. And Eureka's very cosmic. And so his whole life, he's kind of looking inward into like, a tactile, wormy, dark, fraught death. And then when he finally gets the big one, the one that really matters to him, he becomes celestial and outward looking. It's really, I don't know.
What accounts for that, do you think?
I think it, maybe there was a release, and maybe there was also like a desperate need to not rationalize, that's not the word I'm looking for, but a desperate search for some kind of hope. I don't know. Some people don't have a lot of respect for Eureka. Paul Collins called it crank literature. It could just be where he was at in his life. I have no idea.
And I wonder too, could it have been that her death was so devastating to him that, and I have heard people say this when they describe the loss of a child, the absolute worst has happened.
Yes.
Nothing worse can happen than this.
Yes. It's the horrible freedom.
You're like a release, like what you said.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was really just kind of the ultima thule for him. Like, and he was already alluding to these cosmic concepts as Virginia was dying. Like he's just started to, he just started to put his thoughts heavenward. And that's why, and I don't know if this is physically, humanly possible. And maybe as a thanatologist and a death doula, you can give me some insight. But do you believe it is possible for people to will themselves to die?
Absolutely. It happens all the time when couples have been together for years, when one person dies within days. And I think it's less, I don't know if it's conscious. I'm not sure it's a conscious impulse, but dying of a broken heart, this actually happens. I mean,
Yeah.
there's data.
Because this is my personal theory, is that after Virginia went, Poe began to look heavenward, and he began to subconsciously will all of his bodily functions to shut down and die. And he was like, I'm ready, like, take me. And that's
Sure.
why the end time behavior was so erratic and bizarre and impulsive, because he didn't give a flying F anymore. He's like,
it's like his own personal leaving Las Vegas in a way.
Yeah. So I think that was just him looking heavenward and being like, take me, I'm ready.
Right. Yeah. I have no need now to be here.
Yeah. And this is, as an artist and a writer, it's very difficult for me to talk about Poe in these terms, because I don't like propagating the myth of the tortured artist.
Sure.
Impoverished artist. And
you don't want to fetishize him either.
You don't. And that's why on my tours, I'm always trying to pull it back to, like, let's talk about the time Poe rode a skiff or trained a bobolink, or let's talk about other things he did that weren't like death adjacent and melancholy, because I don't want there to be this destructive myth out there in the ether. But unfortunately, you can't read the texts and not, like, go there. So
right. And that's probably why he does appeal to so many people on some level, fortunately or unfortunately. I mean, we don't want him to be seen that way, but then again, if it exposes people to his work.
Yeah. And I think there's just really very few other ways to see him. He has other facets of himself for sure. But I think ultimately he's very modern, and his struggles are very modern. Especially to New Yorkers. Like, I don't know how it is in other cities, but when I read about Poe, and I'm sure it's similar in every urban center, but like his struggle to pay rent, to find housing, to publish, to meet deadlines, he had to schmooze, he had to, you know what I mean? Like, there's something about him that feels very modern in the way he would just, and
doing socially self-destructive things too, I think is something everybody can identify with. I mean, there's a lot about his life that is widely identifiable.
Extremely so. And like, we all do stupid things we regret, and like, regret is just a through line with Poe, and dumb decisions. And I feel like he's very comforting to people, because like, no matter how bad your day was, I'm telling you, his was probably not much better. So I don't know. I find it that way.
Yeah. Well, Emily's coming on, and we're gonna I think there are some questions, but first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about two things. On Friday, January 26th, we're having a special Spirit of Science where Dan, Dr. Lee, and myself are going to talk about an upcoming paranormal investigation that we are doing with Andrea at Poe Cottage on January 30th, which is Virginia's death day. And we will be doing this in the room in which she died, which contains the bed in which she died. So we'll be talking about all our pre-planning on the 26th, and you can register on the Merchants House website. And then in February, we'll be talking about the results. But I just wanted to let everybody know that this is upcoming, and we're all very, very excited about it. And very thankful to the Bronx Historical Society, who run Poe Cottage, for allowing us to do this. They're excited about it also. So, yeah.
It's so exciting. It's all very exciting. And this was such a wonderful conversation. I loved hearing, just to listen to the two of you chat about Poe. It's been a wonderful experience. We are going to go ahead and open up the Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, you can pop them in the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen. Let's start here. Somebody asks what your favorite trait is in Poe's writings. This person says that for them, it's the setting.
Mm.
Have thoughts?
Well, I was before the program started, I was telling Andrea that when I was in elementary school, I read The Telltale Heart, and I lived in a house that had plank flooring, and it I was terrified for years. So I agree with that. I find the settings very, very evocative.
I like the originality of the concept. Like, I'm just thinking of a couple of short stories that I'm going to be reading this week for my book club. And there's Berenice. If you haven't read Berenice and you've ever had a nightmare about your teeth falling out, proceed with caution. It's a creepy body horror about teeth. Valdemar, which he wrote on Amity Street, about being hypnotized at the point of death and lying in a liminal state of stasis between life and death for like 7 weeks. Bizarre stuff. Murders in the Rue Morgue, which I hope this isn't a spoiler for anybody here, but Death by Primate is pretty original, although apparently there was a rip from the headlines element to that even, but nonetheless. Just the shocking originality, like not shocking, but incredible, impressive originality. And yes, in terms of the setting, like these unforgettable set pieces and this imagery, like I'm thinking of a Mask of the Red Death moving from one room to the next, and there's different colors in each room. So yes, the set pieces, the beauty, the originality, the imagery, it's really astonishing that one person came up with all of those various totally bonkers ideas. Like there's nothing derivative about these works, and it's so impressive. It's so amazing.
Somebody asks here, you're talking about Poe as sort of a modern figure, and asks about some of the new modern adaptations of Poe, including The Fall of the House of Usher on Netflix recently. And that actually just made me wonder too, if we could maybe talk a little bit about, there have been so many adaptations of Poe's work, not just modern, but I mean, going back, and maybe like, why is that? What is it about these things that makes them so, what is it about his writing that makes them so accessible for adaptation, or so appealing for us to watch in sort of new forms?
Well, Poe is the #1 most adapted American writer of all time, period. He has more IMDb credits than any other American author ever. And the reason I think why his work translates so beautifully to a visual medium is because Poe was a highly visual person himself. And like I was just referring to the imagery and the set pieces in his short stories. And he also like has this wonderful sense of rhythm and of pacing. And, you know, he was a visual artist as well as a writer. In college, it was like his friends used to make bets about whether he'd become a painter or a poet. So he has an incredible visual sense. He has a wonderful sense of timing and pacing. His stories are very compressed. And so they're just wonderfully adaptable. And it's ironic because he tried his hand at playwriting once. He tried to write a play called Politan, and it sucked, and it was a flop, and everybody hated it. But he had that narrative in his blood. Both of his parents were actors. So he had an innate sense of dramaturgy, even if it didn't quite come off the one time he tried it. But I think it's because he has a really strong visual sense, and that comes across in his writing. I don't know, Matilda, what do you think?
I mean, yeah, I would agree with that 100%. Like when you're reading Poe, you can see the scene.
Yes.
You know, you can actually, you know, with some authors, it's kind of hard, or maybe maybe you have your own visualization and then you see a movie adaptation of it and it's completely different, or the character looks completely different. That's never happened to me with Poe. Even The Fall of the House of Usher on Netflix, which I didn't particularly like, still felt very authentic to me. There wasn't anything I would have seen differently, I don't think.
That's interesting, especially with the conversation about sort of the place, or the sense of place in Poe's writing. I think that's all sort of a piece.
What was really interesting, if you think about the Netflix Fall of the House of Usher, I didn't love it either. I got reference whiplash. It was difficult for me to like take myself out of each story that way. I also found that it didn't look great. I thought it was really dark. I didn't think it looked great. I had a lot of problems with it. But one thing I appreciated about the series was the way, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way it seemed to have no definite sense of a location, a tangible location, because while Poe's sense of place and setting is superlative, and occasionally he sets things in specific areas like France, Paris, whatever. For the most part, his things are fairly removed from a geographical reality. Like, where is the House of Usher located? Nobody knows, right? So with some exceptions, he mostly has his things be in like amorphous, indeterminate places. And I appreciated that in the show, the location was indeterminate, and the locations looked sort of diverse, and and even like the ecosystems looked diverse. There was one shot of someone's house where the front had palm trees, and it looked a bit like South Carolina. And I was like, is he referencing, the gold bug here and something else there? And like, so that I thought was probably for me one of the more interesting aspects of the show, how it was unmoored from a real geography. Because it's not the terror of Germany, it's the terror of the soul,
Right,
So
right.
points for that. Subtract many other points for other things I had quibbles with. But overall, yeah, interesting.
Let's do a couple more. There's a specific question and then a more general question. Somebody asks your opinion of Poe's relationship with Mrs. Shu.
People might not know who Mrs. Shu is. So she was she was the proprietress of the Shu Clinic, right? Which was on Bond Street, Andrea. Okay,
yes, where Il Duco is now. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 blocks from the Merchant's House. And that was a practiced water therapy there. And Poe went to that clinic.
Yeah, and he was friends with Joel Shu, her husband, who was a doctor. So Mrs. Shu, who I believe was a nurse by profession, she was friends with the Poes. She was close enough to be part of their inner circle when Virginia was dying. She visited the cottage. She held Virginia's hand as she died. She corresponded and visited extensively with Poe. I don't think they had a romantic interlude or relationship. I think that's a bit exaggerated. Some say he wrote the bells while at her house on 10th Street, which is possible. She certainly would have tried to keep him temperate. That is completely in keeping with her whole thing as a hydrotherapist and temperance woman herself. Legend has it she sat him down in her house and was write a poem, and that was the bells. All of what we know about Mrs. Shu, or most of what we know, comes from her own letters. It comes from her own correspondence and comes from her own recollections. So it's biased. It may be imperfect. I think they had an interesting friendship. I don't think that some people say Virginia asked Mrs. Shu to marry Poe after she passed away to sort of, keep him on the straight and narrow. I don't know. That's possible. She may have been closer friends to Virginia. We don't know a lot about Virginia's social life. So yeah, I always describe her, and she is in my mind a family friend. That's what I think of their relationship. But I'd be intrigued to hear other people's theories and hypotheses about that. Because the Shus are an interesting couple.
And then a more general question: if you had the opportunity to sit with Poe and ask a question of him, what would you ask?
Oh God, Matilda, you have to start.
Oh my
question here.
I'm not sure. I mean, part of me would ask him how he kept going in the face of so much tragedy. I mean, even with maladaptive, behavioral strategies, it's just amazing to me that someone can suffer so much death and abandonment and kind of keep going for as long as he did. That's what I'd ask him.
I was going to say, Matilda, you can use this as to start brainstorming what you can ask when you do your investigation at Poe Cottage and see if there's answers that we're able to get at the investigation.
Yeah, my questions are twofold, and one I think would make him upset, but if I could guarantee that he wouldn't get mad at me, I would ask him what the real deal was with his marriage to his very young cousin. I'd be like, come on, really? What was going on there for real? We all want to know. I would want to know if they had lost any babies. I would want to know if she had ever been pregnant. I'd want to know that for sure. And then I would want to know on a more professional level if I often get the sense that Poe had deadlines to meet, And you can sort of feel when he's rushing his deadlines, and you can also sort of feel when he's phoning it in, and you can feel when he's sort of self-mocking. And I want to be like, I'd want to go through all my favorite stories and be like, okay, so when were you like taking the piss? Like, when was that kind of you making fun of your friends? Like, is that a joke? Is that real? Tell me what happened there. You know, were you being really serious? Is that sincere? Like, what, you know, Pim, that ending is you're running out of time, right? Like, I want to know. I want to know. And then there's a very upsetting anecdote that I read in Valentine's old manual of New York, where Poe comports himself in a very unbecoming way. I would like him to clarify if that really happened. You know what? Now it's going to become like Thanksgiving dinner with your conservative uncle, and then it's going to become uncomfortable because, yeah, there are things about Poe that I think we don't look at too deeply because of when he died. And had he lived a few more decades, there would be more questions that I would want him to answer. I would want to answer to the question about a woman named Judith who took care of Poe in the Allan household when he was a child. And apparently her stories frightened him as a child. And I would want to know more about Judith and her relationship with him and her influence on him, because if what I've read is true, then the entire oeuvre of Poe owes a huge debt to an illiterate enslaved woman who cared for him as a child, who received no credit for anything. I would also like to know how Poe feels about the merchandising of his name and image, because there are millions of dollars being made off him right now. And I mean, I guess I know how that would make him feel, but I would like to hear him phrase it in his own words, because I think he would have some very choice bon mot in that regard. I don't buy a lot of Poe merch for that reason, because it makes me angry on his behalf. So yeah, people are always surprised at how little Poe merch I own, but yeah, I find it upsetting.
Well, I think that that's all the time that we have for this evening. I want to give just a huge thank you to Andrea and Matilda for this wonderful chat. If you enjoyed tonight's talk and would like more Poe in your life, in addition to the In the Spirit of Science coming up at the end of the month, on Friday, this Friday evening, which is Poe's birthday, you can join us on Zoom for a virtual poetry reading with actor John Kevin Jones, who does our very popular Christmas Carol at the Merchant's House. So you can register for that online at merchantshouse.org/calendar. Excuse me. The Merchant's House is open for visitors on Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, with options for both guided and self-guided tours. And so we hope to see you very soon, whether virtually or in person. Tonight's talk was presented free of charge, but we do hope that you will consider making a donation in support of our fight against the development next door. You can donate online at merchantshouse.org/support. A big thank you to William and Village Preservation for co-sponsoring tonight's talk. And again, a huge thank you to Andrea and Matilda. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, William.
Great night.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks, everyone. And I just want to add real quick, if you, like us, can't get enough Poe, Burrows of the Dead does a Poe walking tour every fall. We do them every October, and we have walking tours all throughout the year. We've just put together a Valentine's Day tour, which has some Poe content on it. And that has currently sold out for February 14th, but we've added a second date on February 17th, and there are tickets available for that on burrowsofthedead.com. So yeah, please join us for that, and we'll talk in even more depth about his weird love life. For a perfect gift for your Valentine's Day loved one. So there you go.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.